through tunnels at age 9, learning the only lesson the Underhive teaches. Power is knowing something someone else needs and making them pay for it. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Before we get into it, a word for Starforged, officially licensed Warhammer merch for people who take the hobby seriously. No cheap prints, no flimsy fabric, just gear that looks as good as the lore deserves. Head to starforged.com, use code VOID for 8% off everything. All the details are in the description below. Right, back to the dark. Today's story is a Vox recording found inside a wall, left there by a man named Rorvan Gelt, who ran a gang called the Pallbearers in the Underhive of Hive Scathran for 19 years. Born in the Sumps, the lowest inhabited level, where the air tastes like old metal and time is measured in hunger cycles, his mother was a corpse runner. Then he was a corpse runner. Then he became something else entirely. This is not a story about a villain. It's not a story about a hero either. It's a story about a man who looked at the machine, understood exactly how it worked, and decided to be the one turning the handle instead of the one getting fed into it. And about what that costs. Eventually. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. They say every man in the Underhive dies twice, once when his body gives out, and once when the last person who remembers his name feeds it to the recyclers along with everything else. I intend to make that second death take a very, very long time. My name is Rorvan Gelt. I ran the Pallbearers of Hive Scathran for 19 years, and if you are hearing this, it means the Vox recorder I buried in the wall of my old sanctum has been found, and someone with more curiosity than sense decided to press play. Good. Sit down. I have a story for you, and it is not a pleasant one. But then, nothing pleasant ever came out of the Underhive, and anyone who tells you otherwise is trying to sell you something that will kill you slowly. I was born in the sumps of Hive Scathran on the world of Voldremis, and I want to be clear about something from the start. I do not know the exact year. Nobody in the deep sumps keeps calendars. Time down there is measured in shifts, in hunger cycles, in how long it takes for the fungal blooms on the walls to turn from gray to black. My mother told me I came into the world during a period she called the Long Shake, when the lower hive trembled for weeks from some tectonic disturbance far below. She said the settlement's water reclaimer cracked open that same night, and everyone took it as an omen. Half of them thought I was cursed. The other half thought I was blessed. My mother did not care either way. She had a newborn and no water, and that left very little room for superstition. Hive Scathran is not a name you will find on any strategist's map. Voldremis is a world that exists to feed the Imperium's hunger for processed chemical compounds. 12 hive cities, each one a vertical nightmare stacked 9 miles high, all of them dedicated to refining the raw mineral slurry that gets pumped up from the planet's crust. The upper spires belong to the houses, the noble families, the trading dynasties who perfume their corridors and pretend the rest of the hive does not exist. The mid-hive is where the workers live, packed into hab blocks like ammunition in a magazine, running the refineries and processing plants that keep the tithes flowing. And then there is everything below. The Underhive. My country. A place where the light of the Emperor is a rumor, and the only law is the one you can enforce with your own hands. The Sumps are the lowest inhabited level. Below us, there is nothing but collapsed architecture and toxic runoff. The air is thick and wet and tastes like old metal, and everything is covered in a thin film of chemical residue that eats through fabric and skin if you do not keep moving. The people who live there are the ones who have nowhere else to go. Mutants, outcasts, criminals, and the simply unlucky, all crammed together in a maze of corroded tunnels and jury-rigged shelters built from the wreckage of older, forgotten settlements. My mother was one of the simply unlucky. She had been a textile worker in the mid-Hive until an industrial accident took 3 of her fingers and her employment in the same afternoon. No fingers, no work. No work, no hab. No hab, and gravity does the rest. You fall. Everyone falls eventually in a Hive city. The only question is how far. Her name was Tessany, and she was harder than the corroded bulkheads she built our shelter from. She never complained, never explained. She kept us alive through a combination of stubbornness and a talent for making edible things out of materials that should not have been edible. I did not understand until much later how remarkable that was. The sumps killed most children before their 5th year. Disease, malnutrition, the water, the air, the things that lived in the dark places where the light rigs did not reach. I survived because my mother refused to let me die, and I think sometimes the universe simply respects that kind of spite. We were not alone down there. The sumps had a community of sorts, a few hundred people clustered around a functioning water still and a corpse starch processor. That processor was the heart of everything. You fed it dead organic matter, and it produced dense gray bricks of nutrient paste that kept you alive. The entire economy of the sumps revolved around feeding that machine, and that meant someone had to go out into the deeper tunnels and bring back the dead. The people who did this work were called corpse runners. They were the lowest of the low, even by sump standards. They waded through flooded tunnels, crawled through collapsed ducts, and dragged back whatever dead things they could find. It was dangerous, disgusting work, and nobody did it by choice. You did it because you had nothing else to offer. My mother did it for 3 years before her lungs started failing from the toxic water exposure, and then I took over. I was 9 years old, maybe 10. I was small enough to fit through gaps that adults could not, and that made me valuable. For the first time in my life, I was valuable. It is a strange thing to discover your worth is measured in your ability to crawl through holes filled with corpses, but you take what the Hive gives you and you do not complain. I want to tell you that those early years hardened me, that I learned the harsh lessons of survival and emerged stronger for it. That is what the stories always say. The truth is simpler and uglier. Those years broke something in me that never healed properly. When you are a child dragging dead men through tunnels, your hands slipping on things you try very hard not to think about, something inside you makes a decision. It decides that the world is a machine, and people are just parts in it, and when parts break, you replace them. I did not choose to think this way. It chose me, and I will not pretend I fought it because I did not. I leaned into it. It made the work easier. It made everything easier. By the time I was 12, I was the best corpse runner in the sumps, not because I was brave or strong, but because I was systematic. I mapped the tunnels. I tracked which sections flooded on which cycles. I learned the patterns of the underhive, the way toxic runoff flowed and receded like a slow, poisonous tide. Other runners worked on instinct and luck. I worked on information, kept it in my head, and traded it for extra rations, better equipment, small advantages that accumulated over time. This was the first lesson I learned about power. Power is not strength. Power is knowing something that someone else needs to know and making them pay for it. My mother died when I was 13. Her lungs finally surrendered to whatever cocktail of toxins she had been breathing for years. She drowned in her own fluids over the course of 3 days, and I sat with her the entire time because there was nothing else to do. No medikey, no drugs, just a woman suffocating slowly in a shelter made of rust, and a boy watching it happen. She did not give me any last words of wisdom. She did not tell me to be strong or to make her proud. Near the end, she grabbed my wrist and said, "Do not stay here." That was it. Do not stay here. I fed her body to the processor the next morning because that is what you did in the sumps, and because she would have wanted me to be practical about it. I ate my share of the rations her body produced, and I did not feel anything about that, and I think that was the moment I became whatever I am. Whatever I was. I did not stay. She told me not to, and it was the only thing she ever asked of me, so I listened. I packed what little I had into a sack made from a dead man's coat, and I started climbing. Not up toward the mid-hive, not yet. I was not that ambitious. I climbed sideways, out of the sumps and into the underhive proper, where the gangs ruled and the settlements were bigger and the corpse starch came in actual sealed packets instead of gray bricks you had to scrape mold off before eating. I was 13, alone, and I had exactly 2 skills. I could navigate toxic tunnels without dying, and I knew what dead people looked like in every possible state of decomposition. These are not skills that appear on any administrative employment record, but in the Underhive, they made me employable. The Underhive of Hive Scathron was divided into territories the way a carcass is divided by scavengers, each gang claiming the parts it could reach and defend. There were dozens of them, ranging from small crews of a handful of fighters to sprawling organizations with hundreds of members and territories that spanned multiple levels. The big players when I arrived were the Thorn Compact, who controlled most of the weapons trade in the lower sections, and the Vitrulaires, a chem-dealing outfit that manufactured and distributed combat stimulants and recreational poisons. There were the Kindlers, who ran protection rackets across a dozen settlements, and the Chain, a slaver operation that supplied labor to the mid-hive manufactoria through a network of illegal work brokers. And then, somewhere near the bottom of this hierarchy, there were the pallbearers. The pallbearers were not a gang in the traditional sense when I first encountered them. They were a work crew, a corpse disposal outfit that operated in the deep underhive, collecting the dead from settlements that could not be bothered to do it themselves, and hauling the bodies to the nearest functioning processor. It was the same work I had been doing in the Sumps, but on a larger scale and with better equipment. Their leader, if you could call him that, was a massive slab of a man named Dacris Ol. He had been a pit fighter in some mid-hive arena before killing the wrong person's son and being exiled downward. He ran the pallbearers the way he had run his fights, with blunt force and an unwillingness to stay down. He was not smart. He did not need to be. He was large, he was violent, and in the Underhive that is often enough. I walked into their camp on my first day out of the Sumps and told Dacris I wanted to join. He looked at me, this skinny, filthy child with hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much of the wrong things, and he laughed. Not cruelly, genuinely. He thought it was funny. He asked me what I could do, and I told him I could find dead people. He laughed again and said, "Boy, down here the dead find you." But he let me stay. I think he felt sorry for me, which is ironic given how things eventually ended between us. He gave me a bedroll and a half ration and told me I could earn my keep by crawling into the tight spaces that his bigger crew members could not fit. The same work as the Sumps, the same darkness, the same smell. But now I had people around me, and even though those people were crude, violent, and smelled nearly as bad as the corpses they hauled, they were something I had never had before. They were a crew. And a crew, I learned, is the closest thing to family the Underhive offers. The pallbearers numbered about 20 when I joined, and they were a rough collection. Decrease ran things with his fists and his reputation. His second was a wiry woman named Fensha Drool, who had lost most of her left ear to a knife fight and compensated for it by never letting anyone stand on her deaf side. There was Gol Mavic, the crew's chem cook, who distilled a vicious rotgut from fungal runoff and sold it to settlements along our route. There was Breton, an ex-Gilder enforcer who never talked about why he was ex, and Little Senk, who was not little at all but had earned the name as a joke that stuck the way bad names always do. They were not good people. None of us were. But they had a code, unspoken and unwritten, that governed how the crew operated. You did your work. You did not steal from the crew. You did not lead trouble back to camp. And when the crew fought, you fought with it, no matter what. Simple rules, the kind of rules that work when the people following them know that breaking them means being fed into the same processor they haul corpses to. I spent my first 2 years as the lowest member of the crew, crawling into collapsed sections, dragging out bodies, doing the work nobody else wanted to do. It was familiar, comfortable in a grotesque way. But I was watching, always watching. I watched how Decris handled negotiations with settlement leaders. I watched how Fensha managed the crew's logistics, who went where, which routes were safe, which processors were functioning. I watched how Gol's rotgut sales brought in more steady income than the corpse hauling itself. And I watched the gangs, the real gangs, the ones with territory and muscle and connections to the mid-hive. I watched how they operated, how they collected tribute, how they enforced their borders, and I understood something that Decris never did. The pallbearers were sitting on a resource more valuable than any territory or chem lab. We had access to the dead. Let me explain this, because it matters. In the Underhive, when someone is killed, the body is evidence. It tells a story. Who did it? How they did it? Sometimes why. If you control body disposal, you control that evidence. You can make a corpse disappear so completely that no one ever knows a murder happened. You can leave a body where it will be found, sending a message. You can examine the dead before anyone else sees them, and learn things. Who is fighting who? What weapons are being used? Which gangs are expanding, and which are bleeding out? The dead talk, if you know how to listen. And we were the only ones listening. I was 15 when I brought this idea to Decris. I told him we should start charging double, once for the disposal and once for our silence about what we found on the bodies. He stared at me for a long time with those flat fighter's eyes, and then he hit me, open palm right across the face, hard enough to spin me halfway around. He said, "We haul bodies, boy. We do not play games. That is how we stay alive." I picked myself up, spat blood onto the floor, and I said nothing. But I remembered, and I started doing it anyway, on my own, in small ways that Decris never noticed. When I found something useful on a body, a message, a map, a token of gang affiliation, I kept it. I built a collection of secrets, stored in a crevice behind my bedroll, and I waited for the right moment to use them. The right moment came when I was 16. The Thorn Compact, the big weapons trading gang, had been expanding into our collection territory. They did not want our work, they wanted our roots. The deep Underhive passages we used to haul corpses were also perfect for smuggling weapons without enforcer detection, and the Thorn Compact's leader, a calculating bastard named Vervain Scross, decided he wanted them. He sent a crew to intercept one of our hauling teams, beat them bloody, and told them the roots now belonged to the Compact. Decris was furious. He wanted to fight. Fensha told him we could not win a war against the Thorn Compact, and she was right. They outnumbered us 10 to 1 and had actual military-grade weapons while we had clubs and repurposed industrial tools. I went to Dekris and told him I could fix it. He laughed at me again, as he always did when I suggested anything beyond hauling dead weight. But Fensha, who was smarter than Dekris by a considerable margin, told him to let the boy talk. So I talked. I told them that 6 months earlier, I had pulled a body out of a collapsed drainage tunnel that turned out to be Vervain Scross's nephew, a young man named Pollock, who had been reported as missing. The body had 2 auto-pistol wounds in the back and a Vitroller gang marker carved into the chest. The Thorn Compact believed Pollock had been killed by the Vitrollers, and it had nearly started a war between the 2 gangs before cooler heads prevailed. But I had examined the wounds. The carving was post-mortem, sloppy, done by someone who was not familiar with Vitroller markings. The auto-pistol wounds, however, were close range, fired by someone Pollock trusted enough to turn his back on. Someone inside the Thorn Compact. I had kept this information for 6 months, waiting. Now I used it. I told Dekris to set up a meeting with Vervain Scross, and during that meeting I laid out what I knew. I did not make threats. I did not make demands. I simply presented the facts and let Scross understand that we had found his nephew's body, that we knew the official story was wrong, and that this information would be very interesting to certain people within his own organization. Scross went quiet for a very long time. Then he gave us our routes back, and he paid us a monthly tribute for our continued discretion. We walked out of that meeting richer than the pallbearers had ever been, and I walked out of it as something more than the skinny kid who crawled through holes. Fensha looked at me differently after that. Even Dekris, who I think understood that something had shifted beneath him, even if he could not articulate what, started asking my opinion before making decisions. This was the model. This was what the pallbearers could be, not just corpse haulers, but information brokers, gatekeepers of the dead. Every body that came through our hands was a data point, a piece of a larger picture that no one else could see because no one else bothered to look. I began training the crew to examine bodies before processing them. To note tattoos, scars, gang markings, the contents of pockets, the type of wounds, the state of nutrition, everything. I created a system, categories, and patterns stored in the minds of trusted crew members because writing things down in the Underhive is a good way to get killed. Within a year, we knew more about what was happening in the Underhive than any single gang, including the ones doing the killing. Dekris did not like it. He was a simple man who understood simple things, and what I was building was not simple. He felt the crew slipping away from him, not through any rebellion on my part, but through the slow, inevitable gravity of competence. People came to me with questions. People came to me with problems. People came to me with the kinds of decisions that used to go to Dekris, and they did it because I had answers and he had fists. And in the long run, answers beat fists every time. He started drinking more of Goal's rotgut. He started picking fights with crew members over small things. He hit me twice more, once hard enough to crack a rib, and both times I took it without response. Not because I was afraid of him. I was not. But because I knew that his time was ending and mine was beginning, and there was no need to rush the process. The Underhive is patient with those who know how to wait. I was 17 when Dekris finally forced the issue. He came back from a drinking session with Goal, staggering and mean, and he found me in the middle of a meeting with 2 of our newer recruits, explaining how to read wound patterns on a body. He lost his mind. He threw the recruits out, grabbed me by the throat, slammed me against the wall, and told me that he was the leader of the pallbearers, that I was nothing, that I was a sump rat he had taken in out of pity, and that if I ever forgot my place again, he would break every bone in my body and feed me to the processor piece by piece. His face was right in front of mine, red and sweating and twisted with rage and something else. Fear. I could see it in his eyes, buried under the anger. He was afraid of me. This enormous, violent man who had killed people with his bare hands was afraid of a 17-year-old corpse runner, and we both knew it. I did not fight him. I did something worse. I looked him in the eye and I said, "Decris, put me down, and then tell me where Fenshaw keeps the tribute money, because I know you have been skimming from it for 3 months, and I know how much. And I know that if the crew finds out, they will not care how big you are." He held me there for a long moment, his hand trembling around my throat. Then he dropped me. He walked out of the room without a word, and that night he left the pallbearers, just walked into the deep tunnels and never came back. Part of me respected that. He knew it was over, and instead of forcing a confrontation he could not win, he chose to disappear. Some people said he went deeper, into the collapsed levels where the truly desperate scratched out an existence. Some said he died in the tunnels. I never found out. I never looked. The crew did not need a formal vote or a ceremony. The next morning, Fenshaw came to me and said, "So what do we do now?" And that was it. I was the leader of the pallbearers at 17. I wish I could say it felt momentous, like something had shifted in the universe to accommodate my rise. It did not. It felt like putting on a coat that had been hanging on a hook, waiting for me to grow into it. The fit was not perfect, but it was close enough. The first thing I did was reorganize. The old pallbearers were a work crew that occasionally dabbled in information trading. I turned them into an information network that happened to haul corpses. Every runner was now an intelligence gatherer. Every body was processed for information before it was processed for starch. I divided the crew into cells, each responsible for a different section of the underhive, and I established protocols for how information flowed from the cells to me. No cell knew what the others were doing. No single person, except me and Fenshaw, had the complete picture. This was not paranoia. This was architecture. A system designed to survive the loss of any individual component, including, if it came to it, me. I also expanded our services. We began offering what I called quiet disposal. For a premium, we would remove a body so thoroughly that it could never be traced. No evidence, no remains, not even a rumor. This was enormously popular with the mid-hive. You would be astonished how many respectable, emperor-fearing citizens of the middle tiers need someone to make a body disappear. Business rivals, unfaithful spouses, inconvenient witnesses, the detritus of civilized life that civilized people prefer not to think about. We became their solution, and they paid us in things far more valuable than credits. They paid us in access, in connections, in debts. Within 2 years, the pallbearers had grown from 20 ragged corpse haulers to an operation of over 100, with contacts reaching from the deepest sumps to the edges of the mid-hive. We still hauled bodies. That was the foundation, and I never let it slip. But the bodies were now the beginning of a process, not the end of one. Every death in our territory told us something. Every disappearance we arranged gave us leverage over someone. I was 19 years old, and I controlled more information about the underhive of Hive Scathron than the enforcers, the guilders, and possibly even the governor's intelligence apparatus. Not that any of them knew it. That was the point. The most dangerous man in the room is the one nobody notices, and we were very, very good at not being noticed. The old crew adapted mostly. Gol kept cooking his rot gut and never once questioned the changes, which from Gol was the highest possible endorsement. Little Sank hauled corpses with the same cheerful indifference he had shown since before I arrived, and I valued that consistency more than I could articulate. Not everyone needs to understand the machine. Some people just need to keep the wheels turning, and Senk turned them reliably until a tunnel collapse took him in my 5th year as leader. Gol outlasted him by a decade, pickling his organs with his own product, and I suspect he is still alive somewhere, too stubborn and too poisonous to die. Fensha became my right hand, and I need to tell you about her because she mattered. She was 10 years older than me, wiry and sharp-featured, with a mind that worked like a trap. She understood logistics the way I understood information. She could look at a supply chain and see every weakness, every bottleneck, every point where a small intervention would cause maximum disruption. She never wanted to lead. She told me once, early on, that leadership was a disease and that every leader she had ever known had died of it, eventually. But she was willing to serve someone she considered competent, and I was willing to let her run operations while I focused on strategy. We argued constantly. She thought I was too cautious. I thought she was too aggressive. And between those two positions, we found a balance that worked. I trusted her. Genuinely trusted her, which is something I can say about perhaps 3 people in my entire life. She earned it, day after day, year after year, through competence and loyalty, and an absolute refusal to lie to me, even when the truth was something I did not want to hear. She was the only person in the pallbearers who could tell me I was wrong and not suffer for it, and that was not generosity on my part. It was survival. A leader who cannot be told he is wrong is a leader who is already dead. He just has not noticed yet. The second person I trusted was Breton, the ex-guilder. He had been with the pallbearer since before I joined, a quiet, methodical man who spoke rarely and never about himself. He became my enforcer, and he was terrifyingly good at it. Not because he was violent, though he could be when required, but because he was precise. Breton did not waste a single movement, a single word, a single threat. When he walked into a room, people understood that the conversation had shifted from negotiation to consequence, and they adjusted accordingly. He was also the closest thing I had to a moral compass, which is a strange thing to say about a man whose primary function was hurting people. But Breton had lines he would not cross, and he held me to those lines when the easy choice and the right choice diverged. I did not always listen. I regret that now, with the particular clarity that only comes when regret has lost the power to change anything. The third person I trusted. Well, we will get to that. The years between my taking over and my 23rd birthday were years of expansion. Quiet, methodical expansion, the kind that does not attract attention because it does not look like conquest. It looks like service. We expanded our corpse-hauling routes until we covered nearly 80% of the Underhive's inhabited zones. We established disposal contracts with mid-Hive clients through a series of intermediaries so layered that the clients never knew they were dealing with an Underhive gang. We built an information archive, not written, never written, but distributed across the minds of 20 trained rememberers who each held one piece of the larger pattern. And we began offering a new service that I called consultation. For a fee, we would tell you what we knew, who was moving against you, where your enemies were weak, which of your allies was skimming from your profits. We sold truth in a place where truth was the scarcest commodity, and we priced it accordingly. The other gangs noticed, of course. You cannot grow without being noticed, no matter how careful you are. The Thorn Compact, still smarting from my leverage play with Vervain Scross, watched us with suspicion but maintained the tribute arrangement because they could not afford a war on 2 fronts. The Kindlers, the protection racket outfit, learned the hard way when one of their captains ambushed our hauling team, killed 2 runners, and stole our equipment. I did not respond with violence. I sent a message to the Kindler's leader, a woman named Garethi Vom, telling her exactly which captain had ordered the attack without her authorization, and exactly how much that captain had been skimming from her collections. 3 days later, the captain's body turned up in our collection area, and Garethi Vom sent a formal apology along with a request to establish a consultation contract. But the chain was different. Their leader, a man called Oskar Dreiger, was not interested in tribute or negotiation. Dreiger wanted control, absolute, total control over everything that moved through the Underhive, and our growing influence was a splinter in his mind that he could not ignore. He had enforcers on his payroll, contacts in the Adeptus Arbites, or claimed to, and nobody wanted to cross him because nobody was sure how far his reach extended. I met Dreiger once, early in my leadership, at a neutral meeting brokered by one of the independent guilders who operated in the boundary zones. He was an older man, lean and gray-haired, with the kind of face that could have belonged to a mid-hive administrator or a Skolam teacher. Nothing about his appearance suggested violence. That was what made him terrifying. The most dangerous men I have known have all looked like they belonged somewhere else, somewhere civilized, somewhere safe. Dreiger sat across from me in that neutral room and spoke in a quiet, measured voice about cooperation and mutual benefit. And the entire time his eyes were cataloging me, taking me apart, deciding whether I was useful or whether I was a problem. At one point, he leaned forward and asked, quite casually, how many bodies we processed in an average cycle. I gave him an honest number. He nodded slowly and said, "That is a great deal of knowledge walking through your tunnels. Every night." I smiled and said, "It is just dead weight." We both knew I was lying. I did the same assessment of him, and I think he knew it, and I think he respected it in the way that predators respect other predators. We shook hands and agreed to stay out of each other's business, and we both knew it was a lie. The only question was who would move first. He moved first, but not as I expected. Dreiger did not attack me directly. Instead, over the course of 8 months, he began systematically acquiring our mid-hive contacts. One by one, the intermediaries who connected us to our disposal clients started disappearing. Not killed, bought. Dreiger offered them better terms, better protection, better connections, and they switched allegiance because that is what intermediaries do. They serve the highest bidder. By the time I understood what was happening, we had lost nearly half of our mid-hive revenue stream, and the pallbearers were facing a financial crisis that threatened to undo everything I had built. Fensha wanted to fight. Breton wanted to negotiate. I wanted them both to be quiet and let me think. I thought for 3 days, and then I saw it. Dreiger was not trying to destroy us. He was trying to force us into his organization. He wanted the pallbearers' intelligence network under his control, and he was squeezing our finances to make absorption look like the only option. It was smart. Ruthlessly, elegantly smart. But Dreiger had made one mistake. He assumed our intelligence network depended on our mid-hive connections. It did not. Our information came from the dead, and the dead kept coming regardless of who was paying us to dispose of them. So I changed the game. Instead of fighting Dreiger for the mid-hive contracts, I abandoned them entirely. Let him have them. And then I went deeper into the sub-levels that even the Underhive gangs avoided, the semi-collapsed zones where mutant communities scratched out their existence in the chemical dark. Nobody served these areas. The dead piled up because there was no one to collect them. I sent my runners in, established routes, built relationships with settlements that every other gang leader considered beneath their notice. And in those forgotten places, I found something unexpected. I found an army. The people of the deep zones were not the helpless wretches the upper Underhive assumed them to be. They were survivors. Mutants, many of them, twisted by the toxic environment into shapes that the Imperium would call abomination, but functional, capable, desperate for anything that looked like opportunity. I offered them employment, corpse running, hauling, the same basic work the pallbearers had always done. But for people who had been living on the absolute margins of existence, it was a lifeline. They took it. Hundreds of them. And just like that, the pallbearers doubled in size, and our intelligence network expanded into areas that no other gang had ever penetrated. I found Decris among them. That took a moment to process. The massive pit fighter who had once slammed me against a wall and told me I was nothing was living in a collapsed maintenance bay on sub-level 42, and the deep zones had not been kind to him. He had lost weight, lost teeth, and gained a tremor in his hands that spoke of prolonged chemical exposure. His left arm had swollen to twice its natural size, the skin tight and discolored, a mutation that the toxic water bred in those who drank it long enough. He did not recognize me at first. When he did, he went very still, and I could see him calculating whether I had come to finish something. I had not. I offered him the same deal I offered everyone else. Work, rations, a place in the crew. He stared at me with those flat fighter's eyes, older now and clouded, but still the same eyes, and he said, "Why?" One word. I told him because we haul bodies and we do not play games, his own words, thrown back at him across the years. He almost smiled at that. Almost. He took the job. He never called me by name. He never acknowledged that he had once led the pallbearers or that I had taken them from him. He hauled corpses in the deep zones with the same blunt, stubborn refusal to quit that had defined him as a leader, and I assigned him to a sector far enough from our central operations that his presence would not complicate things. I checked on him occasionally, not out of guilt, out of something I could not name then and will not try to name now. Drake realized his mistake too late. By the time he understood that squeezing us had only made us stronger, I had assembled enough information about his operation to destroy it. I knew which enforcers he had bribed. I knew which captains were loyal and which were resentful. I knew about the slavers' transport routes, their holding pens, their clients, and the forged labor permits they used to legitimize their trade. And I used it the way you use a blade, not with one big swing, but with 100 small cuts that bleed the target dry before he realizes he is wounded. I leaked Draiga's bribery records to a rival enforcer precinct. I fed his transport routes to the Thorn Compact. I whispered in the ears of his resentful captains, making sure they knew exactly how much Draiga was profiting while they scraped by on minimal shares. One night, midway through, a Draiga loyalist tracked the whispers back to us. He came with 6 armed men. Breton met them in a maintenance corridor. I did not see what happened. I heard it. Metal on bone, a sound like someone breaking wet sticks, and then silence. And then Breton came back with a split knuckle and a knife wound across his ribs that he treated himself. He never mentioned it again. Neither did I. And I arranged for proof that Draiga had been selling Imperial citizens to Xenos traders to reach people who took that sort of thing very seriously. The chain collapsed over 2 months. Draiga's enforcers were arrested. His transport routes were raided. 3 captains defected with their crews. When the evidence of Xenos collaboration reached the Adeptus Arbitis, they raided his primary holding facility, liberated 200 slaves, and arrested his senior leadership. Draiga himself disappeared. I know what happened to him because I arranged it, but some stories are better left untold. The chain broke and the pallbearers absorbed their territory without firing a single shot. I was 24 years old, and the pallbearers were the dominant force in the underhive of Hive Scathron. Not the loudest, not the most violent, not the most feared, but the most connected, the most informed, and the most deeply embedded in the fabric of the Hive's criminal economy. Every death in our territory fed our knowledge. Every disappearance we arranged tightened our grip on the powerful. Every consultation we sold extended our influence into new areas. And at the center of it all, in a reinforced sanctum 3 levels below the boundary with mid-hive, sat a man who had started as a corpse-crawling child in the sumps and now controlled more of Hive Scathron's secrets than anyone alive. If that is not the underhive dream, I do not know what is. But here is the thing about the underhive dream, and about dreams in general. They are built on foundations you cannot see, and those foundations are never as solid as you think. The third person I trusted was a woman named Iselda Kron. I need to tell you about her carefully because this part of the story is the one I have thought about the most, the one I have turned over in my mind during long nights in the dark, and I still cannot decide if I was a fool or if I was exactly as smart as I thought I was, and it simply did not matter. Iselda came to us 5 years into my leadership. She arrived at one of our collection camps with a group of refugees from a collapsed section on the mid-hive border, people whose hab block had literally fallen into the underhive during a structural failure. Most of them were broken, shell-shocked and useless, stumbling around with that glazed look that people get when their world has physically dropped out from beneath them. Iselda was not broken. She was calm, organized, and immediately useful. She helped the other refugees settle in, she volunteered for work details, and within a week she had reorganized the camp's supply distribution in a way that eliminated the petty theft that had been plaguing it for months. Fenshaw noticed her first, brought her to me. Iselda was mid-hive educated, literate, numerate, with a background in administrative work for one of the lesser trading houses. She was in her late 20s, dark-haired, with a voice that carried the precise diction of mid-hive schooling. What set her apart was her composure. The underhive eats composure, strips it away through constant stress until everyone is raw and reactive. Iselda never lost hers. She moved through the chaos of the underhive like a stone sitting in a river, unmoved by the current, and I found that fascinating. I gave her a position in our logistics operation, working under Fenshaw, and she excelled. Within 6 months, she had streamlined our supply chains and established a record-keeping system using a cipher of her own devising, a substitution code based on numerical sequences that looked like inventory numbers to anyone who did not know the key. It was elegant. She was elegant, in a functional, understated way that I had never encountered before. I will not pretend this was not partly personal. It was. I was 22 when she arrived, and I had spent my entire life surrounded by death and violence and the grinding mechanics of survival. And here was someone who made me feel like a person instead of a function. We talked. Long conversations in my sanctum after the crew had settled for the night cycle, about the hive, about how things worked, about the future. She asked me questions that nobody else asked, not about operations or strategy, but about what I wanted, what I was building toward, whether I had ever considered that there might be something beyond the underhive, beyond the endless cycle of information and leverage and control. I told her I did not think about those things because thinking about them was a luxury I could not afford. She said that was exactly the problem. She was right, probably. But being right about a man's blind spots does not mean you have his best interests at heart. I know that now. I did not know it then. Iselda and I became close. We were practical people in a practical world, and our closeness was practical too. We shared a sanctum. We shared meals. She became the pallbearer's administrator, the person who kept the machinery running while I directed where it went. Fensha did not like it. She warned me more than once that Iselda's composure was a mask, that nobody who had fallen from the mid-hive adapted that smoothly without hiding something beneath the surface. I dismissed it, and Fensha, loyal to the end, backed down but never stopped watching. I should have listened. That is the truth that burns, the one that keeps me awake when the darkness presses in. I should have listened to the smartest woman I ever knew, and I did not, because Iselda made me feel something I had never felt before, and I mistook that feeling for proof of something real. It was the first truly stupid thing I ever did. It was not the last, but that revelation came later. For now, let me tell you about the years of the kingdom. That is what I call them in my mind, the years between 24 and 31, when the pallbearers were at their height and I was as close to a king as the underhive produces. 7 years of power, of influence, of being the man who knew everything and controlled more than anyone suspected. 7 years that taught me the only lesson about power that matters, which is that power is a parasite. It feeds on you while you think you are feeding on it, and by the time you notice the drain, it has hollowed you out and left only the shell. Running the pallbearers at full scale was a constant, grinding effort. Every day brought new information, new threats, new opportunities. I slept in fragments, ate when I remembered, and spent most of my waking hours managing 300 people spread across the entire underhive, every one of them armed, dangerous, and looking for an opportunity to advance at someone else's expense. The money was good. Our consultation fees and disposal contracts allowed me to invest in ways most gangs could not. Medical facilities, training programs, better equipment. I even established a rudimentary pension system where long-serving crew members could retire to a protected settlement with guaranteed rations. This last one was Iselda's idea. Not out of kindness, though she framed it that way. It was brilliant because it created loyalty, the kind that comes from knowing your future is tied to the organization's future, not just your present. But the money and the growth also attracted attention from places I had not anticipated. Our disposal contracts embedded us in the mid-hive economy, and that meant the people who ran that economy took notice. I started receiving inquiries from trading house representatives, carefully worded messages asking about our services. Most I handled through the usual channels, but one inquiry was different. It came from someone who identified herself only as a representative of Imperial interests, and she requested a meeting with me directly. I said no 3 times before curiosity and caution had their inevitable argument and curiosity won. The meeting took place in a neutral location, a decommissioned pumping station on the boundary between the underhive and the mid-hive. I brought Breton and 6 armed crew members. The representative came alone, which was either the bravest or the most arrogant thing I had ever seen. She was a small woman, middle-aged, dressed in the nondescript clothing of a mid-hive functionary, with nothing about her appearance that suggested anything unusual. She sat down across from me, folded her hands on the table, and introduced herself as Interrogator Mavel Thrace, operating under the authority of Inquisitor Lord Havernoth Selk of the Ordo Xenos. I have been frightened many times in my life, but the fear I felt in that moment was different. It was the fear of a man who has suddenly realized that the ceiling above him is not a ceiling, but the underside of a boot, and it is descending. The Inquisition, the organization that could exterminate entire populations on suspicion alone. And here was one of their agents, sitting in my territory, looking at me with calm, professional eyes, and absolutely no fear of her own. Thrace told me several things during that meeting, and every one of them recalibrated my understanding of the world I operated in. First, the Inquisition had been aware of the pallbearers for approximately 4 years. They had been monitoring our growth, our methods, and our intelligence gathering capabilities with professional interest. Second, the information I had used to destroy the chain, specifically the evidence of Xenos collaboration, had reached the Arbites not through my channels but through hers. She had intercepted my intelligence and redirected it through official channels to achieve the same result I wanted, while keeping the Inquisition's involvement invisible. Third, and this was the one that made my blood run cold, Oscar Dreiger had not been a simple slaver. He had been, knowingly or unknowingly, a vector for Jean's Stealer cult infiltration. Several of the slaves the chain had been trading were implanted hosts, and the cult had been using Dreiger's distribution network to spread its influence through the mid-Hive workforce. The Inquisition had been preparing to move against Dreiger when I did it for them, and they were grateful. Grateful, but concerned. Concerned, she said, because an intelligence network of the pallbearer's scope and penetration was either an asset or a threat, and the Inquisition preferred to resolve that ambiguity before it became a problem. She was offering me a choice. Work with the Inquisition, share our intelligence, and receive in return a degree of protection and resources that would make the pallbearers untouchable. Or refuse and face the consequences of being classified as a potential threat to Imperial security by the most powerful investigative body in the galaxy. She said it pleasantly, the way you might discuss options for dinner, and that pleasantness was more terrifying than any threat could have been. I asked for time to consider. She gave me 3 days. I spent those 3 days in my sanctum, and for the first time since I had taken over the pallbearers, I was genuinely unsure of what to do. Fincher said yes immediately. The protection alone was worth it. Breton said no. He did not trust the Inquisition. Nobody sane trusts the Inquisition. Isolde said yes, but carefully, with conditions and limits that would preserve our autonomy. I listened to all of them, and then I made my decision based on a calculation that was both simpler and more complicated than any of them had suggested. I said yes because I had no choice. When the Inquisition asks for your cooperation, the alternative is not independence. The alternative is destruction. The Inquisition's version of a polite request is like the Underhive's version of a gentle breeze. It still strips the skin off your face. It just does it with better manners. It was not really a choice at all. It was a recognition of reality, and I have always been good at recognizing reality, even when it is wearing a pleasant smile and offering me something that tastes like freedom but smells like a cage. The arrangement with the Inquisition changed the pallbearers in ways that were mostly invisible but profoundly important. Our intelligence reports now went 2 directions, into our own archives and into the hands of Interrogator Thrace, who filtered them for anything relevant to the Inquisition's interests. In return, we received resources, medical supplies, weapons, equipment that was generations beyond anything available in the Underhive, and protection. Twice during the first year of the arrangement, rival gangs attempted to move against us, and both times their operations were disrupted before they began by enforcer raids that targeted their staging areas with suspiciously perfect intelligence. Nobody could prove we were responsible because we were not. The Inquisition was, and the Inquisition left no fingerprints. The cost of those fingerprints became clear in my 29th year. Thrace sent me a name, Vornel Ashe, a Medici who ran a small clinic in one of the deep zone settlements we had incorporated into our network. Ashe had been treating mutant communities for years, one of the only people in the Underhive with actual medical training who bothered to work at that depth. Our intelligence had flagged unusual patterns in his clinic, people coming and going at odd intervals. Patients who arrived healthy and left changed in ways our runners could not articulate. Thrace wanted him dead. Not arrested, not questioned. Dead, and the clinic burned. Breton came to me about it. He had visited Ash's clinic twice for treatment on his ribs after the Dryga business, and he told me the man was clean, eccentric maybe, dedicated to his patients in a way that bordered on obsessive, but not a cultist, not compromised. Breton stood in my sanctum and looked at me with an expression I had rarely seen from him, something close to pleading, and he said, "This one is wrong. I can feel it. Do not do this." I weighed it. I weighed Breton's instinct against Thrace's directive, and I chose Thrace because defying the Inquisition over one Mediki in a deep zone settlement was a risk I could not justify when the entire pallbearer operation depended on our continued usefulness to her. I gave the order. Breton carried it out because that is what Breton did, and the clinic burned, and Vornella died in it. 3 weeks later, Thrace's follow-up investigation confirmed that Ashe had been clean. The unusual patterns at his clinic were explained by a simple, ugly fact. He had been running an unauthorized surgery to remove mutation growths from children, procedures that the Imperium did not sanction because the Imperium did not consider mutant children worth the resources. He had been hiding it because the enforcers would have shut him down. That was his crime. Helping children. In the Imperium's defense, they have always been very consistent about their priorities. Efficiency first, compassion a distant second if it shows up at all. And I had killed him for it because a woman with an inquisitorial rosette told me to, and because I was too deep in the cage to refuse. Breton did not speak to me for 11 days after we learned the truth. When he finally did, he did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He walked into my sanctum, and he stood there and he said, "You owe a debt now. You cannot pay it to Ash. Pay it somewhere else when the time comes." I nodded. I did not argue. There was nothing to argue about. He was right, and we both knew it, and the weight of that rightness sat between us for the rest of our years together like a stone. Neither of us could move. I was comfortable. That was the most dangerous thing. For the first time in my life, I was not struggling, not scheming, not fighting for survival or advantage. The pallbearers were secure. Our income was stable. Our enemies were neutralized or deterred. I had Fenshire running operations, Breton maintaining discipline, Iselde managing administration, and Thrace providing a safety net that made the whole structure feel permanent, invulnerable even. And I should have known better, because nothing in the Underhive is permanent, and nothing that feels invulnerable is anything other than a disaster waiting to happen. I remember a specific night during those years that captures the flavor of the thing. A mid-Hive factor, one of our most lucrative clients, came to us with a problem that was almost comically grim. He had killed his business partner during an argument over profit allocation, beaten the man to death with a decorative statuette of the Emperor Ascendant in the partner's own office. The irony of that murder weapon was not lost on me, though I kept my appreciation of it to myself. The factor needed the body to vanish, but more than that, he needed the partner to have never died at all. He needed the man to have left, resigned, moved to another hive. The factor needed a fiction so complete that even the Arbitess would accept it if questions were asked. We gave him that fiction. Iselde forged the documentation, transit permits and resignation letters, and forwarding addresses on a world none of the partner's associates would ever visit. Breton's people collected the body and processed it through 3 separate disposal stages until there was nothing left that could be identified as having once been human. And I, personally, briefed 2 of our mid-Hive informants to begin spreading the story of the partner's departure, complete with fabricated details about a romantic entanglement in another hive that had motivated the sudden move. Within a week, the partner had ceased to exist in a way that was far more thorough than mere death. He had been retroactively removed from the present. his absence filled with a story that was more plausible and more interesting than the truth. The factor paid us enough to fund the pallbearer's medical facilities for 6 months, and he became a client for life. That was our business. Narrative control, pure and simple. We did not just dispose of bodies, we disposed of truths and replaced them with fictions, and the fictions were always more convenient than what they concealed. There were darker jobs too, the kind where the client wanted a death to serve as a message and a misdirection simultaneously. I will not list them. Suffice to say that we became very good at making one death solve 2 problems, and the only people who knew the truth were the ones paying for our silence. These were the gears of the machine. These were the workings behind the wall that the Hive's respectable citizens preferred not to examine too closely. The disaster, when it came, wore a face I loved. I was 30 years old when Fensha died, and the manner of her death is something I still carry, like a shard of metal lodged too deep to extract. She was overseeing a routine collection run in the deep zones, a standard operation along a route we had used 100 times before, when her team was ambushed. Not by a rival gang, by something worse. A clutch of what our deep zone contacts later identified as hybrid creatures, twisted things that were partly human and partly something else, something with too many limbs and eyes that reflected light in ways that human eyes should not. Genes stealers, or more precisely, the offspring of genes stealers, the 2nd and 3rd generation hybrids that a cult produces as it infiltrates a population. They hit Fensha's team from 3 directions in a coordinated assault that spoke of intelligence, planning, and a knowledge of our roots that should have been impossible. Fensha fought. Of course she fought. She was Fensha Drull, the woman who had survived everything the Underhive could throw at her, who had built the pallbearer's logistics network from nothing, who had been my right hand for 13 years. She killed 3 of the hybrids before they brought her down, and the 2 runners who survived said she was still fighting when the creatures dragged her into the darkness. We found her body 2 days later in a drainage tunnel half a kilometer from the ambush site. What they had done to her is not something I will describe. Some things should not be put into words, because words give them permanence, and some things deserve to be forgotten. I grieved. I am not ashamed to say that. I sat in my sanctum for an entire night cycle with the door sealed, and I grieved for the woman who had been my closest ally, my advisor, my conscience, the person who had told me hard truths when everyone else told me what I wanted to hear. And then I locked the grief away somewhere it could not interfere with what needed to happen next. Because what needed to happen next was finding out how a genes stealer brood had known our roots, our schedules, and the exact composition of Fensha's team. That information was restricted. Only a handful of people had access to it. The leak was inside the pallbearers, and it was close to me. I pulled Breton off his regular duties and gave him one task: find the source. He worked for 3 weeks, quietly interrogating crew members, tracing information flows, cross-referencing who knew what and when. And when he came to me with his findings, he did not speak immediately. He stood in my sanctum doorway for a long moment, looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Pity. Breton, the man who had hurt more people than either of us could count, looked at me with pity, and that was when I knew. It was Iselda. The evidence Breton had assembled was not dramatic. There were no intercepted messages, no hidden vox logs, no confession extracted under duress. It was subtler than that, and more damning. Iselda had access to the operational schedules. She managed the administrative records, including the cipher system she herself had created. Breton had discovered that the cipher had a secondary layer, a pattern within the pattern that, when extracted, produced a separate set of messages encoded in a frequency that our standard Vox equipment did not monitor. Messages that went out at regular intervals. Messages that, when decoded by a cryptography specialist, Breton, had borrowed from one of our mid-hive contacts, contained detailed operational intelligence about the pallbearers' routes, personnel, and deployment patterns. The messages were going to a location in the deep underhive that corresponded to the area where the genes-stealer hybrids had been most active. Iselda Cran, the woman I had shared my sanctum and my trust with for 8 years, was feeding intelligence to a genes-stealer cult. And that intelligence had killed Fensha. I need you to understand what this felt like, because it matters for what came next. It was not anger, not immediately. Anger came later, hot and clean, and almost welcome because it was simple. What I felt first was something colder. A recalculation. My entire understanding of the last 8 years shifting and restructuring around this new data point. Every memory re-examined through the lens of betrayal. The late-night conversations. The questions about what I wanted, what I was building toward, whether there was something beyond the underhive. Had any of it been real? Had she ever cared about me, or had I been a target from the beginning, an asset to be cultivated and exploited by something that wore a human face and spoke with a human voice but served an alien hunger that I could not begin to comprehend? I do not know. I have thought about it for years, and I do not know. The genes-stealer cults work through implantation, through biological compulsion, through a psychic bond that overrides loyalty and identity and everything else that makes a person who they are. Iselda may have been a willing agent. She may have been a victim, infected before she ever fell into the underhive, compelled by a biological imperative she could not resist. The distinction matters. Or it should. But when I think about Fensha dying in that tunnel, fighting creatures that were there because Iselda told them where to find her, the distinction collapses, and all that remains is the fact of it. The cold, unbearable fact. I did not confront her immediately. I spent 2 days considering my options, which was 2 days of sharing a sanctum with a woman who might have been an alien puppet while maintaining a facade of normalcy that required every fragment of self-control I possessed. Breton wanted to kill her. Quietly, efficiently, a disappearance like the hundreds we had arranged for others. I refused. Not out of mercy. I needed to know how deep the infection went. If Iselda was connected to the cult, there might be others. The pallbearers might be riddled with compromised agents, and killing Iselda without understanding the full scope of the infiltration would be like cutting off a visible tumor while the disease spread through the blood. I went to interrogator Thrace. I told her everything Breton had found, and Thrace, to her credit, did not say "I told you so," though the Inquisition had been monitoring for exactly this kind of infiltration. She said something worse. She said, "We know. We have known about the cult for 6 months. We have been tracking its growth through the deep zones, and we have been using your network to map its spread. The reason we approached you 4 years ago was not because of Draiga. It was because we detected the cult's early signs and we needed eyes in the underhive. You were the best available option. Everything since then, the protection, the resources, the partnership, it was all in service of this. Tracking the cult, understanding its reach, preparing for the purge. The purge." She said it the same way she said everything else, with that calm, professional tone that treated genocide and grocery lists with equal gravity. The Inquisition had determined that the genes-stealer cult had penetrated too deeply into the deep zones to be excised surgically. The contamination had spread through the mutant communities, through the outcast settlements, through the very populations I had recruited into the pallbearers as my deep zone army. Hundreds, possibly thousands of people were compromised, and the Inquisition's solution was comprehensive and final. They were going to seal the deep zones and flood them with a chemical agent that would kill everything organic within the affected area. Every hybrid. Every cultist, Every innocent person who happened to live in the wrong tunnel at the wrong time. A cleansing, they called it. Standard procedure for a genes stealer infestation of this scale. I sat in that meeting and I felt the world I had built crack along fault lines I had never known existed. The deep zone communities were my people. The mutants, the outcasts, the desperate survivors I had recruited and trained and incorporated into the pallbearers. Hundreds of them were innocent, uninfected, guilty of nothing more than living in the path of something they did not understand. And the Inquisition was going to kill them all because sorting the clean from the infected was too difficult, too time-consuming, too inefficient when a chemical deluge could solve the problem in hours. I looked at Thrace and I said, "There are innocent people in those zones." She looked back at me and she said, "There are always innocent people. The calculus does not change." I went back to my sanctum and I sat in the dark and I thought about my mother. Tessany, who had fallen from the mid-hive because an industrial accident took her fingers, who had survived the sumps through spite and stubbornness, who had told me with her dying breath to not stay here. She had been one of the innocents, the kind of person the Imperium grinds up and processes and never notices. The kind of person Interrogator Thrace's calculus did not account for, because in the mathematics of Imperial survival, individual lives are rounding errors. I thought about the mutant communities I had brought into the pallbearers, people who had trusted me because I was the first person who had ever offered them anything other than contempt. I thought about what would happen to them when the chemicals came, and I made a decision that was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I have ever done. Possibly both. The two are not mutually exclusive, as my life has repeatedly demonstrated. I decided to evacuate the deep zones. Not all of them. I am a practical man, not a saint, and I have never confused the two. I could not save everyone. The deepest sector, sub-level 40 and below, were already too heavily patrolled by cult hybrids to reach safely. Decris was in one of those sectors. I knew that when I drew the evacuation boundaries, and I drew them anyway, and that is a fact I will carry to whatever waits for me on the other side of dying. But I could save some. I could get the uninfected communities out, move them into the upper underhive, beyond the Inquisition's kill zone, before the purge began. I had 6 days. Thrace had told me the timetable, either by accident or by design, and I had 6 days to move approximately 800 people through tunnels that the Genes Stealer cult was actively patrolling. It was impossible. The logistics alone were a nightmare, and that was before you factored in the cult's presence, the Inquisition's surveillance, and the fact that any significant movement in the deep zones would alert both sides to what I was doing. But I had Fenshaw's logistics system. I had Breton's operational expertise. I had the most comprehensive tunnel maps in the Underhive, built over 15 years of corpse running and refined into a navigation network that no one else possessed. And I had something else, something I had not expected. I had Iselde's cipher system. The secondary layer, the one she used to communicate with the cult, could be turned back on itself. I could feed false intelligence through it, create the illusion of normal operations while the real movement happened along routes that Iselda's handlers did not know about. Use the traitor's own tool to blind the enemy. There was a savage poetry in that, and I will admit I enjoyed it. I laid the plan out for Breton. He stared at me for a long time and then gave me 3 words. You will die. Not might. Will. The certainty of a man who had spent his life assessing tactical situations and knew a losing proposition when he saw one. I was aware of that possibility. He corrected me. Not a possibility, a certainty. The Inquisition does not forgive interference with a sanctioned purge. Even if I succeeded, even if I got every single person out, Thrace would know what I had done, and the consequences would be final. I understood. The question was whether he was in or out. He was quiet for a long time. Then in. One word. Because that was Breton. He would tell you you were making a mistake, and then he would stand beside you while you made it. I could not tell Isolde. She was still in our sanctum, still performing her duties, still sleeping beside me while I lay awake and wondered what was happening behind those closed eyes. I maintained the facade, feeding her normal intelligence through the usual channels while keeping the evacuation entirely off her grid. Only 4 people knew the full plan. Me, Breton, and 2 senior cell leaders I had vetted personally. The evacuation began on the 3rd day. We moved in small groups, 20 to 30 people at a time, through secondary tunnels that were too narrow and too dangerous for regular traffic. The deep zone communities did not know why they were being moved. I told them it was a security relocation, a standard precaution against rumored enforcer activity. Most of them accepted it. They trusted me. That trust was the currency I had been accumulating for years, and now I spent it like a man who knows he will never need money again. Breton ran the operations, moving the groups with military precision, using the tunnel maps to route each group along a different path so that no single interception could compromise the entire operation. It was the most complex thing we had ever attempted, and it worked. For 2 days it worked perfectly. On the 5th day, Isolde discovered what I was doing. I do not know how. Perhaps she noticed the irregularities in the population counts. Perhaps one of the evacuees said something to someone who said something to someone else who said something within her hearing. Perhaps the cult, receiving intelligence that did not match what they were observing on the ground, sent a message that alerted her. It does not matter. What matters is that she came to me in the sanctum on the 5th night, and she closed the door, and she looked at me with those calm, composed eyes, and she said, "I know what you are doing." I had prepared for this moment. I had rehearsed it in my mind, played out every possible version, scripted responses to every possible accusation. None of it helped. When the moment arrived, I just looked at her and said, "I know what you have been doing." And for the first time in the 8 years I had known her, Isolde's composure cracked. Not much. A fracture, not a collapse. A tightening around the eyes, a slight tremor in the hands, a change in breathing so subtle that only someone who had slept beside her for years would have noticed. She sat down across from me, and we looked at each other across a distance that was measured in centimeters, but felt like light years. She told me things. Some of them might have been true, that she had been infected before she came to the Underhive, that the cult had been embedded in the mid-hive trading house where she worked, that she had not chosen this, that the compulsion was something she fought against every day and lost every night, that she had tried to protect me, had kept my name and my location out of her reports, that the cult knew about the pallbearers but did not know who led them because she had shielded me. And then, and this is the part I cannot stop hearing, 5 words delivered in a voice that almost broke. It was not all false. What we had. It was not all false. I want you to know that. I wanted to believe her. Emperor, help me. I wanted to believe her with a desperation that frightened me, because it showed me how deep the weakness went, how thoroughly she had embedded herself in the parts of me that I had thought were impenetrable. But I thought about Fensha. I thought about Fensha dying in that tunnel, pulled apart by creatures that were there because Isolde told them where to look. You killed Fensha. She closed her eyes. I did not know they would target her specifically. I fed them roots, not targets. They chose her. You fed them the root and Fensha is dead. The mechanism does not matter. The result is the same. She opened her eyes, and there were tears in them, and I still do not know if those tears were genuine or if they were another layer of the mask. What happens now? Breton was standing behind the door. He had been there the entire time because Breton anticipated these things the way some people anticipate weather. He came in when I opened it, and he looked at Iselda with an expression that was not anger or hatred, but something more final. Professional assessment, a problem identified, a solution required. Iselda looked at him and then at me, and she understood. She did not beg. I will give her that. Whatever she was, whatever the cult had made her, she did not beg. She stood up and straightened her clothes. The information I gave them will lead them to the evacuation routes within 12 hours. You should move faster. Then she walked out of the sanctum with Breton behind her, and that was the last time I saw her alive. I did not ask Breton what happened. I did not need to. The pallbearers disposed of bodies more thoroughly than anyone in the Underhive, and Breton was the most thorough person in the pallbearers. She ceased to exist, and I told myself that was justice, and I told myself that the tears might have been real, but it did not change anything, and I buried it all in the same compartment where I kept my grief for Fensha, and my grief for my mother and every other loss that the Underhive had carved out of me over 30 years of living. We had 12 hours. Iselda's final piece of intelligence, given freely, a warning or an apology or one last manipulation, I would never know. 12 hours before the cult realized their intelligence was compromised and came looking for the evacuees. I pulled every available crew member into the operation, and we ran the last 4 groups through the tunnels at a pace that was reckless by any standard. The 3rd group ran straight into a cult patrol on sub-level 38. The fighting was brief and ugly, and it cost us 4 runners and 11 civilians, including 2 of our rememberers, Corson and Davil, who between them held nearly a third of the pallbearers' accumulated intelligence archive. 15 years of gathered secrets, patterns, connections, gone in a corridor firefight that lasted less than 3 minutes. That knowledge did not just die with them. It ceased to exist as completely as if it had never been gathered, and I felt something tear inside the architecture of everything I had built, a support column removed that could never be replaced. The last group, 43 people including children, was stranded on sub-level 35 when their route collapsed ahead of them. Breton's runners could not find an alternative path because the only alternative was a series of maintenance crawlways that did not appear on any of our operational maps. But they appeared in my memory. I had crawled through those tunnels as a 9-year-old corpse runner, mapping them by feel and smell and the particular quality of the darkness. I had not been in them for over 20 years. I went anyway, because there was no one else who could, and because Breton's words from years ago were ringing in my skull. You owe a debt now. Pay it somewhere else when the time comes. This was the time. Half a lifetime of building an empire, and my most valuable skill was still fitting through holes that grown adults could not. If that is not the Underhive's idea of a joke, I do not know what is. I led those 43 people through tunnels so narrow that the adults had to move sideways, through chemical runoff that ate at our clothing and skin, through sections where the ceiling was low enough that I could feel it pressing against my back, like a hand pushing me down. I went first, the way I had gone first as a child, feeling my way through the dark. And for a few hours I was not the leader of the pallbearers, not an inquisitorial asset, not a man who had killed and manipulated and controlled. I was a corpse runner from the sumps, doing the only work I had ever truly understood. We lost 2 more civilians to a flooded section where the water came up to our chests, and one woman could not keep her footing. I held on to a child for the entire crossing, a girl maybe 8 years old who clung to my neck without making a sound, and I thought of my mother carrying me through places like this, and the circle of it almost broke me. By the end of the 6th day, over 700 people had been moved out of the deep zones and into protected settlements in the upper Underhive. Not 800. Not everyone. Not Decris, who was beyond my reach in a sector the cult had sealed, but more than I had any right to expect, and more than the calculus of reasonable risk should have permitted. On the 7th day, the Inquisition released the chemical agent. I watched from an observation point on level 17 as the deep zones died. You could not see the chemical itself. It was colorless, delivered through ventilation systems the Inquisition had been rigging for months. But you could see the effects. The lights went out in sequence, level by level. You could hear it too, a distant grinding rumble as structures collapsed under the chemical erosion. And then silence. A silence so complete that it felt like the Hive itself had stopped breathing. The Inquisition's estimate was approximately 4,000 dead. Cultists, hybrids, and innocents together, reduced to chemical residue in tunnels that would remain toxic for decades. Decrease was among them. The official record, if one existed, would attribute it to structural collapse caused by geological instability. No mention of genes stealers. No mention of the pallbearers. No mention of a woman named Iselda Kron, who had loved me and betrayed me and warned me and died, all in the same week. The Imperium is very good at making things not exist. Interrogator Thrace came to see me 2 days after the purge. She came alone again, walking into my sanctum as if she owned it, which in a very real sense she did. She sat down and looked at me. 712. That was the number of people I had moved out of the kill zone. She knew the exact count, which meant she had known about the evacuation, possibly from the beginning. Why had she not stopped me? A look that was almost amused, because it was useful. The evacuation flushed cult agents out of the deep zones and into areas where they could be identified and eliminated individually. Your humanitarian gesture gave us better targeting data than 6 months of surveillance. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the familiar sensation of a reality I had constructed being disassembled by someone who operated at a level I could not reach. I had saved those people. I had risked everything, sacrificed Iselda, lost crew members, burned every bridge with the Inquisition, and in the end it had been useful to them. My act of defiance had been absorbed into their plan like water into sand, and the Inquisition had come out ahead because the Inquisition always comes out ahead. That is what 10,000 years of practice buys you. I had spent my entire career being the cleverest man in the room, and Thrace made me feel like a child who had just discovered that the game he thought he was winning was someone else's training exercise. But Thrace was not finished. She told me that my actions, while operationally useful, constituted interference with an inquisitorial operation, and that carried consequences, not death. I was still too useful for that. But the pallbearer's autonomy, such as it was over. From this point forward, we were an inquisitorial asset, not a partner, not an ally, an asset. To be directed, deployed, and if necessary, expended at the Inquisition's discretion. The alternative was the alternative. She did not need to specify. I accepted because what else could I do, and because 712 people were alive who would not have been, and if the price of that was my freedom, then it was a price I could calculate and pay. The years after the purge were different. We were working for the Inquisition now. Not with them, but for them, and every decision I made was filtered through Thrace's oversight. Crew members who had joined because I offered them autonomy and dignity began to drift away as the reality of inquisitorial control became apparent. I could not blame them. I had offered them a lie, even if I had not known it was a lie at the time. Breton stayed. Of course Breton stayed. He was the kind of man who picked a side and remained on it until the ground beneath him gave way. He was also getting old, and the years of violence and toxic exposure were written on his body in scars and stiffness, and a cough that got worse every month. I told him to retire. He told me to go do something anatomically improbable, and we never spoke of it again. He was the last person I trusted completely, and I think we both understood that our time was running out, not suddenly, but inevitably, like water finding the lowest point. I was 34 when I learned something that changed the final shape of this story. It did not come from our archives or our rememberers. It came from Thrace, during what I now believe was her last visit before Delvas replaced her. She sat in my sanctum the way she always did, straight-backed and professionally composed, and at the end of a routine intelligence briefing, she produced a data slate and slid it across the table. A gift, she called it, a token of the Inquisition's appreciation for years of productive cooperation. On the slate was a file from the Administratum Labor Registry of Hive Scathron, dated over 3 decades prior. It concerned a bonded textile worker named Tessany, employed by House Varenthi, terminated for contract violation. My mother who had fallen from the mid-hive after an industrial accident. My mother who had survived the Sumps through spite and stubbornness. My mother who had died of lung failure when I was 13. I had always accepted her story at face value. An accident, a fall, bad luck in an uncaring universe. But the file told a different story. The accident that had taken her fingers had not been an accident. It had been a disciplinary action. She had been caught stealing fabric, small amounts, to make clothes for a child she was not supposed to have. Workers in that manufactorum were bonded laborers, contracted to the house that owned the facility, and bonded laborers were not permitted to bear children without authorization. My mother had hidden her pregnancy, hidden me for the first year of my life, and when the house discovered the deception, they punished her by maiming her and expelling her. The accident was a cover story, a convenient fiction that preserved the house's reputation while discarding a worker who had violated the terms of her bondage. I looked up from the slate, and Thrace was watching me with that calm, measuring gaze. She knew what this information would do to me. She knew about the Sumps, about my mother, about the history that had shaped every decision I had ever made. The Inquisition knows everything. That is their function and their curse. And she had given me this particular piece of knowledge at this particular moment because she wanted me to understand something. That I was known. Completely, utterly known. That there was no part of my history, no secret corner of my past, that the Inquisition had not already mapped and catalogued and filed away for potential use. The gift was a leash, dressed in the language of generosity. I took the slate and I thanked her, and I understood. This information should not have mattered. It was ancient history, irrelevant to the present, a footnote in a story that had moved far beyond its beginnings. But it mattered to me. It mattered because it meant that everything I was, everything I had built, everything I had done, traced back to a woman who had stolen scraps of cloth so her unauthorized child could have something to wear. It mattered because it meant that my mother had not fallen. She had been pushed, and it mattered because the house that had pushed her, House Varenthi, was still operating in the mid-hive, still bonding laborers, still maiming the ones who stepped out of line. I had information about House Varenthi. I had a great deal of information about a great many houses. It would have been very easy to destroy them the way I had destroyed the chain, with 100 small cuts applied with surgical precision. I did not. I considered it. Emperor knows I considered it, lying awake at night with the knowledge burning in my chest like an ember that would not go out. But I did not, and the reason is simpler than you might expect. My mother told me not to stay. That was her last instruction, her only request. Do not stay here. She did not say go back. She did not say get revenge. She said move forward. And destroying House Varenthi would have been looking backward, reaching into the past with bloody hands to rearrange something that could not be rearranged. My mother was dead. Revenge would not resurrect her. It would only feed the machine that had consumed her, the endless cycle of violence and retaliation that keeps the hive churning. So I let it go. I put the data slate in a drawer and I moved on. I tell you this because I want you to understand something about me. I am not a good man. I will not catalog my sins for you because neither of us has the time and the list would not fit on any scroll the administratum produces. But there was one moment, one choice, where I could have been cruel and I chose not to be, and that choice cost me nothing except a revenge I did not need. If that is the only decent thing I ever did, I will take it. It is more than most people in the Underhive can claim. Breton died on a wet Tuesday in my 35th year. I call it Tuesday because the Mid-Hive keeps that calendar, and it was the closest approximation I had. He died sitting in a chair in the pallbearer's medical facility, waiting for treatment for his cough, which had worsened into something that produced blood. He was sitting there and his heart stopped. No violence, no enemies, no dramatic last stand. His heart, which had carried him through decades of combat and hardship and loyalty, simply decided it had done enough and stopped. The Mediki said it was likely a long-term consequence of toxic exposure, combined with accumulated stress and old injuries. A death by accumulation. All the small damages of a lifetime adding up until the total exceeded what the body could bear. I have heard that this is how most people in the Underhive die, not in a blaze of violence, but in a quiet surrender to the arithmetic of damage. Breton deserved better. He deserved a death that matched who he was, something significant, something worthy of a man who had spent his life standing in the line between chaos and something slightly less chaotic. Instead, he died waiting for medicine, and the indignity of that still makes me furious in a way that I cannot adequately express. After Breton, I was alone, not physically alone. I still had the pallbearers, still had crew members, still had the organization and its operations and its obligations. But the people who had known me, really known me, who had seen the boy from the sumps and watched him become whatever he became, they were all gone. Fensha, dead. Iselde, dead. Breton, dead. My mother, dead. I was 35 years old and I was surrounded by 300 people and I was the loneliest man in Hive Scathron. That is the cost of the crown, if you want to be poetic about it. Everyone who helps you build it is eventually consumed by it, and you sit alone at the top wondering if the view was worth the climb. I found myself walking the tunnels at night during that period, the deep routes I had memorized as a child. I walked them alone without guards, and I think part of me was hoping that something would come out of the darkness and finish it. Nothing ever did. I walked past the collapsed section where Fensha had died, and I stood there in the chemical dark, and I listened to the dripping and the distant hum of the hive's machinery. 20 years in the Underhive, 20 years of building something out of dead men and secrets and leverage. And what did I have to show for it? An organization that served the Inquisition, a sanctum full of ghosts, and a pair of lungs that were already beginning to betray me, though I did not know it yet. I ran the pallbearers for another year after Breton's death, but the machinery was winding down. The Inquisition's control had tightened incrementally, each new directive removing another layer of autonomy, each new operation demonstrating more clearly that we were instruments, not agents. Thrace had been replaced by a younger interrogator named Delvas, who had none of Thrace's subtlety and all of her ruthlessness, and who treated the pallbearers as expendable assets to be used and discarded as operational needs dictated. I watched crew members sent on missions that were transparently designed to benefit the Inquisition at the pallbearers' expense, and I could do nothing about it because the arrangement I had made, the cage I had walked into with my eyes open, did not include a door from the inside. I started recording this. Everything you are hearing now. I requisitioned a Vox recorder from our equipment stores and began speaking into it during the night cycles when the sanctum was quiet. Maybe I wanted a record. Maybe I wanted someone to know what the pallbearers had been. Maybe I just wanted to talk to someone who would not report back to the Inquisition. Whatever the reason, I talked. Night after night, I told my story to a machine, and the machine did not judge me and did not forgive me, and that was enough. I was 36 when the cough started. My cough. The same one that had killed my mother, the same one that had plagued Breton. The Underhive's signature, stamped on the lungs of everyone who breathes its air long enough. I ignored it for 3 months, then went to the medici because the blood was becoming hard to ignore. Accumulated toxic damage. Progressive and irreversible. Perhaps a year. The Underhive's medical system at its finest. You come in with a cough, you leave with a countdown. I walked back to my sanctum and sat down, and I felt relief. The kind of relief a man feels when he finally sees the horizon after a very long march and knows the walking is almost over. I spent the next months putting things in order. I appointed a successor, a woman named Grethel Crone, who had been running our northern operations for 6 years, and who had the right combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and pragmatism to keep the pallbearers functional under inquisitorial control. I briefed her on everything. The archives, the contacts, the arrangement with the Inquisition, the history. All of it. She listened without expression, asked precise questions, and at the end said, "I understand." 2 words. The same 2 words Fenshaw would have used. Maybe that is why I chose her. I did one last thing before the end. I went back to the sumps. Not the same sumps I had grown up in. Those were gone.